Bé, jo crec que és hora de començar, que ja passen 4 minuts. Benvolguts tots a aquesta primera sessió del cicle de reflexió i debat sobre docència universitària d'aquest curs. És la quarta del cicle, vam tenir 3 abans, el Francesc Ibermont, la Jan MacArthur i la Mercè Gisbert, el curs passat. Sabeu que hi ha una xerrada cada trimestre, i aquesta és la primera que tenim la sort de tenir aquí l'Stephen Sterling. I ara, si em permeteu, el que faré és canviaré a l'anglès, perquè és així una mica educat parlar, que entengui la persona que ha de parlar. Doncs, let me repeat that. Welcome to the first session of the cycle of reflexió i debat sobre docència universitària of this academic course, 2024-25. Today I have the pleasure of introducing Stephen Sterling. He's a pioneer in the education for sustainable development. He was one of the first people actually to have coined the term education for sustainable development back in 1992. So Stephen is an emeritus professor of sustainability at the University of Plymouth, where he served for many years as the head of education for sustainability. His journey in education, however, started much earlier and began in secondary school classrooms, in both in the UK and Canada. But since then, Stephen has had an impressive career that has spanned multiple roles. He has served as the deputy director of a national environmental NGO. He worked as a consultant in environmental sustainability education for international agencies like UNESCO, government agencies, academia, charities, and NGOs, including the WWF in the UK. And he also founded the Education for Sustainability program at London South Bank University. So Stephen has a long list of publications, achievements, and recognitions that I'm not going to list here because it will take too long, and the idea is to listen to what he has to say. But let me just say that throughout his career, Stephen has been a tireless advocate for systemic change and the idea of a sustainable university. And through his leadership in reorienting higher education to tackle the extraordinary global challenges that face societies, he has inspired an international movement for sustainability in education. So recently, Stephen has collected his essential writings in a new book titled Learning and Sustainability in Dangerous Times, where he offers a compelling and stimulating perspective on how education can truly make a difference in securing our future. He will talk a little bit, and I suppose most of the talk or part of the talk will cover what he has in that book. But let me just leave the floor to Stephen and let him present that perspective by himself. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and for being here. Thanks.
Thank you, Umberto. Bon dia, hola. That's as far as it goes, I'm sorry. So welcome to this talk. So I'm from England, clearly, and I live in the southwest of England, and my university is in Plymouth, which is right down in the southwest corner. So thank you. I was last in Barcelona maybe 12 years ago to give a lecture at a different university on the same topic. So the topic is still very important, and I hope what I say today is of use to you and helpful. So to get started, so I didn't know much about UPF or anything really, and I'll put this on. Yeah, okay. So I looked it up, and I see that the university is one of the leading universities in Spain, so I feel honored to be invited to talk to you today. I've been working in environmental and sustainability education for a scary, wait for it, 50 years. That makes me feel very old. And why I've been doing this, because I think it's a really important area, which I think hopefully I will make clear. And I've been concerned with how far education, formal education, and universities in particular, are responding to global issues and crises that we're facing, and which are affecting communities virtually everywhere. And my argument is that higher education, which I've been working in for a long time, is responding to these crises. It is responding, but not fast enough and not deeply enough to the realities of complexity and instability and unsustainability, and the need for rapid socio-economic transition to a safer and more livable future. And I think there's a time lag between what's happening globally, which is a period of rapid change, and the ability of universities to keep up with the rapidity of that change. So I think it's for us, for academics, for policymakers, for students to really rethink what are we doing to really address the way the world is and the way we want it to be, let's say. And I think global society now is in a transitory state. We're shifting from the old story to a new story, and the new story is still being formulated. And this is why it's both a scary and an exciting time, because we have to deal with the scariness and we have to make a better future at the same time. So the old story is one of indefinite economic growth without respect for limits. It's about globalization, about increasing inequality, individualism, environmental decline. And we're struggling to make a new story which is regenerative and life-affirming, and with well-being and environment at its core, appropriate to this new, what's sometimes called the Anthropocene age. So can we break through to a better world, or are we going to experience breakdown at some point? This is not scary talk, this is science, if you like. So we're in a position of unprecedented urgency and risk, which is presenting a rising challenge across all sectors, including education. And I think really, if you step back globally, our species is in a learning crisis. We need to relearn how to live on this planet in a safe way. And it seems to me, looking at what this university is doing, you're doing some great stuff already, which is fantastic. Congratulations on that. But let's look at what the issues are and see where we can take this work. So, excuse me just a sec. So I often start off with this slide. I like the use of cartoons in teaching, and if you can't see that, I'll read it to you. If I go too fast, by the way, if anybody's English is not as their second language, I sometimes get a bit excited and go too fast, and then my wife, who's sitting there, will frown at me, and I shall slow down. Anyway, so the cartoon reads across, our way of life is being threatened by a dark force. We must defend our way of life. What is this dark force which threatens our way of life? It's our way of life. So it's it's a circularity, if you like, that we're undermining our own future, if you like. So there are increasing calls on all sectors, government, business, civil society, to change course radically to secure the future we want. So what is the role of education in this movement? And it's surely to help create the future we want, but within planetary boundaries. So this next slide, a few years ago I was asked to write a lead paper for an organization called the Great Transition Initiative, on the topic of the pedagogy of transition, educating for the future we want. And it's just a screenshot of the slide of that website. And my lead essay stimulated a great response from thinkers and practitioners all over the world and these were edited and put on this website. So we've got theoretical ideas on the left, and then practical examples of what can be done on the right, and that material is there. So that's by way of introduction, and then that's the talk in 4 sections: context and challenge, critique, vision, and design. So starting at number 1, context and challenge, where are we now? So, as I said, I started all those years ago as a young man, concerned about the environment, really, and I'm going to come out just for a second to say hello, because I always think this is a barrier, and part of this scheme is dropping barriers. So here I am, in the flesh. Okay, there you go. Yeah, 15 years ago, as a young man, I was really excited by this thing on the right, the Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment. It was the first intergovernmental conference to bring all the governments together to look at these issues, which really then were about resource depletion and pollution. That was the emphasis. And so we've had a dialogue internationally all these years since. So this is why I came in. So, and as a student, I went to a London bookshop and I found this book on the left, Teaching for Survival. I thought, wow, what a title. That was 52 years ago. And so that's even more relevant now, all these years later, Teaching for Survival. Maybe we could have a book called Teaching for Thriving. You know, that would be even better if we get past the survival. Yeah.
If you can use that.
Oh, you need my friends to get recording? I've been put back in my box. So.
Maybe if you want, you can use
Oh, okay. No, I need this slide anyway. Okay. Sorry. Okay, start again. So that book, Only One Earth, accompanied the conference, The Care and Maintenance of a Small Planet. The Limits to Growth study came out at the same time, a hugely important study on the future, really, what the scenarios were ahead, and it caused a lot of fuss amongst both environmentalists who were excited by it and also by traditionalists and conventional people involved in growth who rubbished it because it was so threatening. But anyway, that's where it all kicked off. And now, this is years later, there's a whole slew of books coming out on these topics around economics, environment, and development. I think the book on the far right, Earth for All, influenced my own writing. And it's really saying, you know, if you look at it, it's called a survival guide for humanity. Well, if that's not on every politician's desk, I don't know what is. You know, this is really important stuff. The regeneration book I would recommend. It's really hopeful about what can be done and what is being done. And some of my talk might be a little bit depressing, but I should also say there's an awful lot of good stuff going on in response to these issues. You know, good stuff, which we should back. Okay, so the Limits to Growth led years later to the authors rewriting some of that work, and they called it Beyond the Limits, Confronting Global Collapse, Envisioning a Sustainable Future. So, you know, people say, well, what do you mean by sustainability? And I think this quote from the Meadows, that's Donella Meadows, who's the chief author, I think it's really good. It's very clear. You know, a sustainable society is one that can persist over generations, one that is far-seeing enough, flexible enough, and wise enough not to undermine either its physical or social systems of support. And where have you got to? This was 1992. That's when that was written. So the debate's been going a long, long time, but now there's talk about what's called planetary boundaries, what's called the safe operating space for humanity, which are the planetary limits, the physical limits, which should influence the way we do things as a species, really. And 7 of these boundaries, climate change, biodiversity, biogeochemical cycles, freshwater resources, and so on have been crossed already. And then there's people trying to look at this. You may have heard of Kate Raworth, the donut economics, trying to rethink economics so we can do things within these planetary boundaries. And the other thing to say about that is that these boundaries are interlinked. These limits are interlinked. So it's still going on the gloom bit for now. So this is Antonio Guterres, the UN Secretary General, talking about these triple crises: climate change, biodiversity, loss and pollution. And the point about this, these issues are interrelated. They're not separate. We tend to see issues as separate. They're not. Systemically interrelated. So if you look at the World Economic Forum, here they came up with this term, polycrisis, which just means that all these crises are interlinked. And you don't have to look at the detail, that's just making the point, really. So this idea of these crises interlinked was preempted by the Limits to Growth Club of Rome report of 1972, which came up with this idea of the world problematique, saying you can't take one crisis out by itself, you have to see it as a knot. I mean, the good news, in a way, is that if you do something good in a way, that has a ripple effect too. You know, the systemic interrelationship means that if you can do something which is positive, it actually has a good effect on the whole. So we might come back to that point. Still on international discourse, you may or may not have come across the fact that we've just had a global summit of the future. How many people actually know that? One person, two people, yeah. I'm not surprised, you know, I'm not surprised you don't know about it, but this is a big do, you know, this was commissioned by Secretary General, had a huge meeting of governments looking at where things are going, and it's all positive. He's saying that the Sustainable Development Goals are badly off track and we need to get them back on course. But I see all this is very positive, but it's late in the day, you know. If I think about my involvement in this over half a century, you know, we're still talking about these issues, and we should have got things on track by now. So still on the same theme, these are two reports I'd recommend if you're interested in looking at this in more depth. From United Nations Environment Programme, this came out in July, a Global Foresight report on planetary health and human well-being, a really important, informative and well-presented report. Global Tipping Points, that was presented to the last COP conference on climate change. So we've got an awful lot of information at our fingertips. It's whether the policymakers do anything positive with it, really. So it begs the question for us educators, you know, which future are we backing? You know, is it we are at a historic crossroads, and do we choose the left-hand path, which is more of the same, and go down the drain, or do we actually try to create a safer, livable future? And I think, again, as I said already, I think the key here is you know, societal learning, really, as a whole, not just what happens in the classroom, but society as a whole. So here's something about the social learning revolution. I think it has three aspects. Intentioned unlearning of habits and ideas that got us into the mess in the first place. Relearning approaches that are more sustainable and life-affirming, which you might have forgotten about. And new learning that has the potential to sustain human and natural systems and well-being into the future. So all this, I hope you see, sets a challenge for education, and formal education in particular. And I put this slide in because it's interesting. This is from Monash. It's a leading university in Australia. And they had this event a couple of years ago called Learning to Accept Responsibility, the Priority for Education in and Out of Times of Crisis. and had two key questions. What kinds of learning do we need to foster rather than undermine planetary health and community resilience? Secondly, what is at stake when we don't accept responsibility for ensuring that our education systems and lives benefit both the planet and all our tomorrows? Fantastic. That's great stuff. But the fact that they're looking at that, tick, well done, but what have we been doing all these years that we're now thinking about this? What have we been doing before? We've been, I don't know, irresponsible education or non-responsible education? I don't know. It sort of raises that question, if you like. So I came up with this term some time ago, which works in English, and I don't know if it works in Spanish or Catalan, which is response, hang on, let's get it right, Steve, that's it, not responsibility, but also responsibility, okay, which is the ability to respond in the right way. And I think it's responsabilitat in Catalan, I believe. Thank you. So what stops universities and their members responding adequately to the challenges we face? What stops us doing that? And I think that's a critically important question for the whole sector. So this is a critical comment from a writer. You read that for yourselves, and the second sentence is particularly good, I think. So that's that first section, and I'm going to go on to the second section, critique. It's critique. So for me, my question that I've asked myself and people I work with for years has been this, really. How should and how can education and learning be rethought and reconfigured to make a significant and central contribution to achieving a more sustainable and just world? And I think that stands up, and it's self-explanatory. But I also thought sometime later that it needs to be, this same question is valid, but it needs to be asked at a deeper level. And this is what I mean. Same issue viewed from a deeper level. What is the nature of the change of consciousness that appears necessary for achieving a safe, more ecologically sustainable and livable society which can both survive and thrive? What changes may be required in the way we view and practice education and learning if they're to contribute fundamentally to a change of consciousness? So that's a deeper way of looking at the same issue. Now, I'm not the only one to talk about this shift. So if you look, I've worked with UNESCO a lot over more than 20 years. And if we look at this slide, in 2016, they have a thing called the Global Education Monitoring Report, which looks at trends in education globally. 2016 was the first time this report looked at sustainability and planetary futures. This cartoon comes from the report. And look what it says above the cartoon. I'll just do the pointer there, if it works. No, it doesn't work. Doesn't seem to anyway. Okay, so anyway, you can read that for yourselves. And then the quote in the middle column. And I particularly like the line in italics from the Assistant Director General for Education in UNESCO. We are increasingly asking if what people learn is truly relevant to their lives, if what they learn helps ensure the survival of our planet. Wow. What's the answer to that? Well, maybe they're not. Maybe they're not. And then on the right is the UNESCO's current policy document, which they call a roadmap for education for sustainable development to 2030. And then UNESCO also then commissioned in 2021 this thing, the International Commission on the Futures of Education, which is good, and it's interesting that they echo. This is an independent commission, and the commission echoed UNESCO's belief that education itself must be transformed in order to be transformative. So it's a double step. Look at the middle quote. To shape peaceful, just, and sustainable futures, education itself must be transformed. Education systems often reproduce and perpetuate the very conditions that threaten our shared futures. Wow, you know, that's quite a hard-hitting quote from a major international body. Then, 2 years ago, we had this Transforming Education Summit, and again, it's rethinking education for the future. And then, just to conclude what's going on internationally, the International Commission gave rise to UNESCO's Futures of Education initiative. You don't have to read all the little writing there. But this is really an ongoing debate on where education should be in relation to major trajectories and trends in society and the planet. It's big stuff. It's important stuff. And then part of that is this conference coming up in Korea in December, renewing education to transform the future. But again, look at this powerful quote from the background paper to this conference coming up in December. We face an existential choice between continuing on an unsustainable path or radically changing course. Education is critical to this change of course, yet education itself must be transformed. So this is the nub of the issue. Education is seen as the means by which we can get this change, but itself has to change in order to make that change. You know, it's complicated. And my argument, this is where I'm going to shift gear, if you like, is well, comes out in the next section. So here we are, vision. What shifts are required? And I think at a deeper level, it's all about our worldview. The way we see the world is key to this argument. Still back at the global level for a moment. The way we see the world, we need to shift from a reductionist and mechanistic way of seeing the world and education towards a more holistic and ecological view. So these two books, for example, make a distinction between the assumptions, values, and values of what we might associate with the old story I talked about at the beginning, leading to a threatened future, and the emerging ideas and values based on systemic and ecological thinking, which are necessary to address the situation of polycrisis, which I talked about. So at heart, we've got an issue between mechanistic and anthropocentric thinking on one hand, and an ecological and ecocentric view of the world on the other. And these kind of books, and these are two of the key ones, say we need the more ecological, systemic, holistic, connective way of seeing the world in order to make what they call the Great Leap or the Great Transition or the world we must create. Okay? So that's the fundamental distinction. And that's what I argue in a lot of my writing. And I put this slide in because it shows that it's not just people like me, but this actually comes from a business journal a few years ago, and where the authors make a distinction between an analytical orientation and an ecological orientation. And the left-hand side, there's the positivistic, analytical way of doing things and seeing things, tends to be ingrained in educational thinking and practice. And the ecological one, which we need, is much less apparent in most educational practice. But this argument is not new. So this next slide It's 1991. This is where the author is saying, he says that in 1991, that's a long time ago, we should create the learning that enhances critical thinking, the understanding of the self, the systems and environments in which we live, and the situations we experience. We need to understand and manage complexity, cope with ambiguity and uncertainty, and grasp the connectedness and independence of the systems of which we are part. And I love this cartoon because you've got the teacher showing a straight line, as in linear economics, you know, A causes B, and that's it. And the student pops out the door and goes, whoa, you know, all this stuff is going on. So there's a difference between what they're being taught and the complexity of the real world, you know. So I've been working on this a long time, and I worked on a teaching pack on systems thinking some time ago, and myself and my team came up with this two ways of thinking, if you like. So the left and the right again. So the left-hand side tends to be say, ingrained in educational thinking, and we call that box thinking, putting things in boxes. So, you know, universities are organized in boxes. You know, the silos idea, you have different subjects which will never meet and never talk to each other. You know, or sit in boxes too, like this one. And then on the right, this is the more dynamic, flexible, open-ended way of thinking. And this is what we need to move towards in order to deal with that complexity that the last slide talked about. Okay. I think, oh yeah, there we are. There's the other metaphor. A web-like thinking rather than box-like thinking. I knew that was there somewhere. Okay. Now, this can be summarized in terms of educational paradigms, if you like, between the mechanistic and the ecological here. It's a very simple way of representing the difference. How can we shift from towards these two sets of ways of doing things? Now, the next slide, well, I'll show you in order to explain this, but I can't make the pointer work, but never mind. But this is a model, if you like, a thinking model, a thought model, which makes the point that there's different levels of knowing and understanding, if you like. So at a deeper level, our paradigm or worldview, whether we're talking about an individual or an institutional or even a whole society, shared worldview, influences the beliefs and values that we then held. Doesn't determine them, but influences. Those values influence the norms and assumptions that we make, which influences the ideas and theories we propound, which influences our actions. It's just kind of a subtle kind of bubbling up from the bottom, if you like. And you can argue whether it's valid or not, but it's a way of thinking about thinking. So I use that model, and then apply that to education, we get something like this. So the educational paradigm influences the purpose. What do we think education's for in the first place? Which influences policy and policy making, which influences provision and pedagogy and practice. Okay, so if we just make a few shifts at the top, the most practical level, without thinking more deeply about policy and paradigm, not much changes. And I make the analogy, it's like building an eco-house on unsupported foundations. You know, we need to look more deeply at this whole picture, if you like. And there's a lot of thought now on, if you take these big issues I'm talking about, on repurposing, not just in education, but in business too, repurposing business to work within planetary boundaries, which I talked about earlier. but also repurposing education. And this is, again, is part of the UNESCO debate going on. Okay, so let's look at purpose, because it's so key. One of the authors of the Limits to Growth book, Donella Meadows, was a great systems thinker. She's died some years ago, an educator, and she talked about purpose being key to what happens in an institution. So if you change the purpose, the whole lot changes. So it's a very powerful lever. So if we look at purpose, education, what is education for? So traditionally, it's for socialization, which is absolutely fine. That's understood. It has been for thousands of years. That's what education is partly about. It's partly about preparing people for employment. Traditionally, it's also been developing the innate potential of people, to what they bring to the learning situation. But now, because we're in this situation, this pickle, we need a more transformative function. Again, this is what UNESCO and the whole debate is talking about, in order to address these issues and move towards a safer future. Now, if we can get some emphasis on that, it's not a matter of abandoning the other three, but transforming all of them in that effort, in that endeavor. You know, they all become part of this new way of doing things. Okay, so still on purpose, there's a shift going on. So you've got education as it is, as it was in the past, and it's different now than it was, as it should be. How should it be now? Debate, question, discussion, and how practicable is that? So there's an issue here about how quickly education can change, because it's traditionally very slow to change. That said, you know, the whole neoliberal paradigm has shifted the whole of educational thinking within the last 20, 30 years quite quickly. It's not what it used to be because of the whole neoliberal influence, which is another big discussion. Okay. So, yeah, the neoliberal pressure, really, on educational thinking has been a squeeze, I think, on purpose and practice in many ways. So rather, we need a more liberated view of education, which is more open-ended, explorative, and experiential. And I think a lot of students are saying that too, really. So then I start looking at the implications of what I'm saying here in practice. Again, it's a shift from the left to the right. So the left is entrenched, and it's still very present, and it has a certain amount of validity, but how can we shift to a more dynamic view of education and dynamic way of doing things towards the right? So, in current conditions of uncertainty and flux and instability, we need this more dynamic view of education and learning rather than the rather static model that's been characterizing education practice for many years. So the shift out there is on building resilient systems that can withstand disruption, and regenerative systems, particularly economic systems and ecological systems. And this demands a different kind of inquiry, I think, and practice. Part of it is to do with competencies. So there's a lot of work going on what's sometimes called sustainability competencies. I was involved, it's 2 years ago, I think it was, with the EU, even though I've been pushed into a Brexit box, I was allowed to work with the EU. Don't get me started on Brexit. So yeah, the whole international team, of which I was one, looked at this, and it's called Green Comp. So it's an EU initiative. I thought it was really good. A lot of consultancy and thinking and work went into it. And they came up with 12 competencies for a greener world, if you like, a more sustainable world. And I think it's a good piece of work, and it's meant for everybody, really, not just schools or universities. And it's worth checking out. Green Comp. And UNESCO has done similar work, which echoes that work. So, I tend to produce frameworks which help practitioners. So this is one which kind of helps open things up. So, So questions: opening up space for critical and systemic thinking. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 8 to 9 themes or aspects of any issue. And this is just stuff which may be useful, in a teaching situation and looking at particular issues. To get students to think laterally and more deeply about systemic connections between issues and so on, rather than a reductionist, simple cause and effect kind of way of thinking about issues. Now, part of this new pattern is certainly involves interdisciplinarity, which I know this university is working on, and transdisciplinarity. So this slide just makes a comment about that. Barriers to interdisciplinarity and what factors help promote it. So we get a more sophisticated understanding, a more holistic understanding by disciplines working not just together, but creating new meanings by coming together, which is what transdisciplinarity implies. So we talked about transformation and a transformational worldview, and this next slide is my take on that, if you like. Transformational, which is where you can look at the difference between first order, second order, and third order learning. That's another whole area. But I think if you take the simple triad of values, knowledge, and skills, which is in all educational thinking, values, knowledge, and skills. What do we need? I think that becomes transformed into a deeper triad. So let's look at that. So values becomes seeing, perception, expanded ethical sensibility or consciousness. Knowing becomes a critical understanding of pattern, consequence, and connectivity. And the doing becomes the ability to design and act relationally, integratively, and wisely. So this is what I call my triad model. It's 3 parts. You can also see it in terms of epistemology, ontology, and methodology, if you like. You can also see it as heart, head, and hands, if you like. So it kind of works in different ways. But it's trying to get this deeper, meaningful educational experience to try and enlighten, what should I say, cultivate this deeper consciousness I was talking about. Because the way society thinks at the moment is leading us down a very dangerous path. And this is why we need to think more systemically, holistically, ecologically, and all the rest of it, in my view, but not just my view. Practical terms, these kind of approaches to education are part of this more systemic way of teaching and learning, and you'll recognize these, I think, or some of these. But to what end? Why would we adopt these approaches? It's because we need to move towards resilience in systems, So we've got resilient learners on the characteristics of a resilient learner on the left, in order to try and develop regenerative and resilient systems, social, economic, and ecological, on the right. To equip people to be involved in this regeneration of community, ecological, and planetary health, if you like. And I'm looking forward to going to the conference tomorrow on planetary health, which you're holding here at UPF on this very topic. Okay, so last section. Going forward, how do we enact change? Well, that's a big question. So this is, if you like, about the responsibility I talked about earlier. Okay, so journeying towards institutional transformation. So I've been involved a lot with my own universities and other universities and in how to respond to the sustainability crisis and opportunity. And a conventional response is accommodation. You sort of build it into what you're doing already without changing very much at all, really. And you maybe get sustainability ideas into some parts of your curriculum or whatever, and that's kind of job done. Except it isn't. You know, it's just a start. It should be just a start, and it's a welcome start, but it's problematic because that's all a university does. And a deeper, more full response is on the right. So the university becomes adaptive, dynamic, critically engaged, and innovating institution. So this is, you know, if you take this on board, you think, wow, this is, how the heck do we do that? Well, answer, you don't. Not all at once. It's a learning journey. And the point about this is it involves everybody, not just the students, but the policymakers and the cleaners and the lecturers and all the stakeholders. It's a learning journey, and it takes time. You know, we worked at our university I was there for 12 years on this, and we got a long way, but there's still a way to go. But at least if you've got an idea of what you're aiming for, it helps, you know, and you look at other people's experience. This one, towards more sustainable institutions. So I wrote a book with colleagues on the sustainable university. You know, what does that mean? Well, it means shifting from the worst of the silo mentality, if you like, on the left, towards a much more integrated, coherent, dynamic, learning institution. How can it be a kind of a microcosm of a more sustainable society itself? Great, if you can move in that direction. So I make the point that it's a double learning challenge. So, you know, if you talk about responding to sustainability, you think about, okay, we need to change some of these courses. Let's get some of these ideas into these courses, blah, 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 blah. And then we've done our bit. And you think, well, okay, that's good. Isn't it? Well, yeah, it is. It is. But as I've just tried to imply in my previous comment, it needs organizational learning. So there's two areas, what I call arenas of learning. So the social learning response to sustainability in organizations, institutions, and interactors. And you need the stuff on the right-hand side in order to get the stuff on the student experience going at a more profound, deep, coherent level. And it's a dynamic between the two. So the students can teach their lecturers, and the lecturers can teach their students. You know, fantastic if you can get that dynamic going. And if you look at the universities that have done most in this area, they've all had organizational learning consciously part of their ethos. It's not just tweaking a few curricula. It's more than that. Okay, Not easy. I'm not saying any of this is easy, and these are barriers. And research has shown, these barriers come up time and time again. These are the types of barriers, if you like. And they're real, and I think we have to accept they're real. And it's not easy, but it's not impossible either. Okay. 5 or 10? 10. Great. I could do it in 10. Thank you. So the next slide is, again, coming back to this idea of response ability, the ability to respond. I think it's helpful to see it in stages, if you like. No response is that what it means. Nothing, nothing happens, nothing changes. I haven't really got time to go into the depth of what different orders of learning mean, but only to say that we're talking about depths of learning when I say first order, second order, third order. So we could have like an accommodative response in the university where some changes are made, but the system doesn't really change itself in terms of its policy and its assumptions or whatever. A reformative response, so conformative to reformative, where you have a deeper shift. There's more going on. You start seeing changes one way and another. Some significant shifts of perspective and policy, where you do get system change in some way. And then a deeper one is a transformative response, where sustainability ethos drives the whole thing, which is tough. I've been involved in an independent college, which sadly has just come to the end of its life after 30 years, called Schumacher College in Devon, which is an independent college, but it did an extraordinary 30 years of work making this third way of responding mean something in a deep way. It's a fantastic college and experiment, if you like. And they had the example of the advantage of being small. It doesn't help to be small. But if you look at international experience now, a lot of universities are trying to get this deeper, more connective, involving, inclusive way of responding to the sustainability crisis and opportunities. This is becoming more apparent in practice. So, coming to my last slides now. Responsibility at individual level or an institutional level maybe has three aspects. An emotional response, so you actually feel it's important. You get it intellectually, you understand what it's all about, and you're able to do something about it. At my university, at Plymouth University, we worked, as I said, for 12 years, and then I retired, but it's still going on. This is our learning. After 12 years, these are the things we learned, and they may not be the same as what another university learns, but we've learned that doing these things, working towards these things, were lubricants, if you like. They kind of oiled the wheels. They made the thing work by making these things, giving them potency, if you like. And I could talk about any of these in some depth, but if I go back to the silos thing, universities are structured like that in silos. What we did as a team, we did this. We connected people across. We did this horizontal connectivity, and things start happening, So, health people would talk to design people, who would talk to engineers, who would talk to scientists, and you get all kind of interesting stuff happening by making these connections. Fantastic, and people get excited. So yeah, it was great, and it's not always easy, but when dynamic things happen, then senior management wake up and say, "Oh, this is interesting," and you start getting support. somebody said it's not top down, it's not bottom up, it's middle out. You know, it's the middle doing the dynamic stuff, and it draws people in. Anyway, there we are. I need to wrap up pretty quickly. But a couple of years ago, I was involved in putting together an e-book on. It was called Repurposing Universities for Sustainable Human Progress. And we got some really good contributions. And myself and my fellow editors came up with 5 points in our closing editorial: that this change is not an option, purpose is key, deep change can unlock win-wins, we're all in this together, and the writing's on the wall in the sense that we need to get going with this. You know, things are urgent. And there's a pretty powerful statement at the end, which we don't apologize for. We need to, because I think it's true. The question of reimagining and repurposing higher education for sustainable human progress is a challenge that all stakeholders need to embrace fully if collectively we are to assure a future beyond the apocalyptic one in prospect. And that e-book, which is available for nothing, I think, so far has 163,000 hits and downloads, which to me indicates there's a hunger for this new thinking, you know. I really do think there is. I've got a couple of minutes maybe to say something a little bit more practical. So here's a couple of slides which help with that maybe. So this is, again, is like a thinking tool which you can use. How far does an educational policy, curriculum, or pedagogy take account of context, congruence, criticality, commitment, contribution? It works in English. I don't know about other languages as the 5 C's. I think you will get all these slides, by the way, or the talk, so don't worry about writing stuff down. So people have found this framework quite useful. Also, I think 10 years ago, I worked on a guidebook for an organisation called the Higher Education Academy in England, or the UK, I should say, which is called the Future Fit Framework. And it's 10 years old, but it's still valid, and it's used a lot by people. And again, it's saying, regarding what we do now, whether it's a lecture or a policy or whatever it is, in terms of the sustainability agenda, this is the 4 R's, which again works in English. I don't know about Spanish or Catalan. What is the value that we need to keep? So I'm not one of these people who say we need to tear everything up and start again, because you can't anyway. But this good stuff always goes on. So what's the good stuff? Retain that. What might need modification in the light of this agenda? Revise that. What might we need to abandon because it's outmoded or doesn't help, it's not helpful anymore, or pushes us in the wrong direction? Well, let's get rid of that. And then lastly, what new ideas, concepts, principles, methodologies, etc. are needed? That's renewal and innovation. So it's the 4 R's which can be used as a thinking tool as we move forward. So that's nearly it. A quick plug, if I may, for my new book, which I wrote last year. And a lot of this stuff is in there in much more depth if you're interested. I did bring a few copies over, all the way from Devon. I don't want to take them home. If somebody would like a copy, that would be great. They'd be €25, which is a saving on the book price. If you'd like them, that would be great. So a lot of this stuff is in much more depth in this book. Should that be of interest? This I tend to finish with because I think it's such a great slide. Jakob von Uexküll is the founder of the Right Livelihood Award. I think it's just a very good quote. And I like to think I'm a possibilist rather than a pessimist or an optimist. So what can be done, in other words? What can be done? And I think the doing creates its own dynamic, if you like, and draws people in and gives you heart to take this agenda forward, which I think is exciting, actually, and positive. And then lastly, key websites, and there's an awful lot of stuff going on. When I did the research for this book, I thought I knew quite a lot already, but I came across all kinds of initiatives going on I didn't know about, and I think that's great. You know, it's indicative that people are responding to these crises and opportunities, and there's lots of networks and new organizations popping up. So this is just some of them, and some of these I've referred to in my talk. My own website is here. A lot of my stuff is buried in there, and you can find out much more should you wish. And I think I'm out of my 10 minutes probably, so that's my last slide. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for the talk. We have time to have questions and, from the audience. Yes, Jacques.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for the comprehensive talk. I had a question from practical sense. Thank you. I had a question about the practical sense about evaluation. So here, you present different views in which we should change, the word university words, the way the curricula is said.
Yeah.
But an important part is evaluation.
Yeah.
So right now, we focus perhaps, in Europe we introduce continuous evaluation, so there's activities that students do throughout that I think speaks towards a lot of this, that students are more active, but at the end there's a final exam, which I think it's needed when you have 200 students in a class. So what's your view on how we should change the evaluation system to align more with some of the concepts that you're talking about? Because that's still, it's competition, and maybe it doesn't reward everything that they're studying, but we need an objective view to allow students to continue. So what is your view on this?
Yeah. Well, I think it's not my area of expertise, but I don't need that back. I've got, yeah, that's on. That's on. Yeah, it's not my area of expertise, but I worked as external examiner for a very innovative course at the University of St Andrews up in Scotland, which is looking at, it's on sustainability and development. And they set out to it's very interdisciplinary for a start. There are 12 different faculties and departments were involved in delivering it, which caused problems in itself. But they also wanted to shift pedagogy so that it was much more in line with this kind of thinking. So they had a lot of innovative pedagogies, but also a lot of involvement by the students in peer review. So a lot of working in groups and a lot of evaluating each other with the help of a lecturer. So, and also in terms of their delivery, they would do a lot of applied research in the community, and then they would present that in a conference. So then the students were involved in evaluating the delivery of the project reports in the conference. So they were looking at ways of getting out of the normal way of doing things, if you like, as far as they could, and it seemed to be quite motivating for the students and quite successful. So I think the issue with just sitting in exam halls with exam papers, maybe that's got to be a part of it, but it has to be not the only part, I think, in terms of the suite of activities you might develop. Yeah. But the actual design of the design of the issues, you know, and the assessments in the first place is also part of it, I think, in order to develop a more holistic way of inquiry. Yeah. So it's not my expertise, but maybe that helps a little. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello, thank you so much for inspiring talk. I was thinking about when I was looking at the pyramid paradigm, purpose.
Yeah.
It made me think of a recent paper that I was like wondering about, which was doing a review of, let's say, environmental and sustainability education practices. They've actually found that the more environmental education is introduced in schools, that's studied by Andrew Coles, an environmental psychologist and colleagues at the University.
Sorry, can you hold it slightly closer to your...
Yeah. And what they found is actually the more environmental education courses we introduce in schools, the lower the degree of environmental practice afterwards. Surprisingly, right? Meaning that they actually found that the schools that did not have embedded some sort of environmental educational practices in the courses had students that eventually end up being more environmentally conscious or more politically engaged. So I was thinking, why could that be? So what's wrong with this sustainability? I mean, so there must be something more, let's say, content-based, non-experiential sustainability teaching and learning. So this means that actually reproducing sustainability courses in standard university school structures seems to be counterproductive. So it really really for me confirms the need to really rethink the very purpose of education, the way we produce thoughts, and the need to co-create, and the need for learning that's actually embodied, that's convivial, that's together, that's critical, that challenges actually. Yeah. But I don't know, that's a comment on the paradigm, I think. And actually for me reaffirms the need to rethink the purpose and paradigms of education.
Yeah. So it's more of a comment than a question, is that right?
Yeah. You feel like
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting that you've come across practice which doesn't seem to work. And maybe that's just in the way it's done, in the delivery in some way. You know, if we just... I mean, it just reminds me that a colleague of mine who, some years ago wrote a really good paper about how if you get this wrong, it just makes everything worse. In the sense that if you put a load of guilt and fear into students, it's just going to disempower them. You know, and it's a good paper because it sounded alarm bells about how not to do things, you know. So I do think it's, and we live in such perilous times, I think the way that you work with students is really critical and has to be very sensitive to where they are, particularly with the whole issue of eco-anxiety, you know. And you know, I, as you can see, I'm getting old. You know? but when I learned as a teacher years ago, I was a school teacher, by the way. I wasn't just doing this stuff. Years ago, I was a school teacher with kids, and it was great. But I was taught in those days when the philosophy was very different. It was about respecting the whole child, you know, and whole school thinking, and the heart, head, hands, and all that stuff. And that seems to have been forgotten into a much more functional way of seeing education now. And I think we need to regain some of that more humanistic way of loving our students, really. And love has got to be part of it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. All these reflections and all these frameworks which are very useful. My question, and I've been thinking during all the talk about empirical tests of these proposals, not just on the institutional side, but mainly when we relate with students, because the context is not helping us as far as I see. Maybe you have another perspective, but there is a belief about relating to lower salaries associated with sustainability jobs. And there is no clarity on the embeddedness of sustainability in other positions, mainly indicators or results that they will find whenever they go to the market. So my question is, if there is a body of literature, because I'm not in this educational for sustainability field of study,
Yeah.
so I wonder if there are sources, reliable sources on empirical tests of what works and what doesn't work today with digitalization on all these contexts in terms of bringing up this new approach while teaching sustainability to students. Thank you.
Yeah. Well, I'd merely, well, a lot of those websites I showed at the end would be helpful in that regard. But also, as I said, I've worked with UNESCO for a long time. I have some criticism of the way they do things, but that's outweighed by my huge thanks and respect for the work they've done for more than 30 years. And there's an awful lot of accumulated wisdom in the documentation which they produce and case studies which are available now. They've just begun a new initiative on schools in particular, and there's an awful lot of increasing amounts of case studies and guidances which are available. And I would just encourage you to look at their stuff, and it will lead you down lots of different alleyways. But compared to even 10 years ago, there's a whole wealth of experience and information out there. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. Maybe I think that is very important to bring this reflection about the peace and the sustainability. I think right now we cannot separate the peace with the sustainability development and sustainability in general. For example, right now we see through the televisions, mobiles, the war in Gaza, in Ukraine, and in a massive. Yesterday I was talking with different people and say it will happen in the 60s and 70s, maybe the reaction were different. So what the professors and students right now are so passive? What is the pedagogy that we need to change, because it is indeed the root of the sustainability. So maybe I want to provoke maybe some reflections about that. What need to do? Because this is in the role of the curriculums, in the role of the evaluations. So what need to do for that? Because I believe that we are in a limit. In this moment. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Are you going to help answer that, Grian? This should maybe be a dialogue between all of us, rather than just me. But I'm not trying to get out of it. But if you want to respond to any of the questions yourself, please indicate. There's no simple answer to your question, of course, and I think that we are in a critical stage. We really are, looking at all the indicators of what's happening globally. But this slide I showed about possibilism, I think is important because I think the crisis is engendering a response. The response, that response is often very, in my view, is very positive. There's a lot of very good stuff going on because of the crisis in response to that. And I think particularly locally, this whole movement towards regeneration and regenerative economics, regenerative agriculture, and so on, circular economy, all this stuff is all fairly new, but it's very positive. And I think for students, if you can help them see that this movement is flourishing and help them be part of that, particularly at a local level. So there's now a new emphasis on localism, regenerating communities and local ecologies and so on, local growing and so on. All of that is positive, and I think we have to not get caught up too much in what's happening, which is saps the spirit, if you like, saps the spirit, and we become depressed or unable to respond. Be part of this constructive movement, which is definitely happening. What more can I say? You know, it's. I think as educators we have to not ignore the changes and trajectories which are happening, which are taking us in the wrong direction, because that would be false to try and ignore that, but also help students deal with that in a constructive way by pointing to all the positives which are also happening, and help them be part of that, empower them to be part of that positive response. And I think that, has a huge potential. I don't know what other people think. Grian, do you want to say something about that? I mean, Grian is a friend. He's a leading activist on this stuff, and he's a wise man. So that's quite a build-up for you, Grian.
I have seen that you are using your wonderful analysis of the Gregory Bateson's theory of living levels and social change.
Yeah.
And I want to, because I found also that Donella Meadows,
yeah,
in her leverage points to change a system, a civilization
yes,
system, she said that she coincides with Gregory Bateson in the two higher levels for obtaining this social change, this big social change. Worldviews in
yeah,
second place,
yeah,
and in the first place, something like Gregory Bateson and you in your analysis, and I have seen in your levels of learning, the transformative learning, maybe there is a transpersonal nature in this higher level, transformative level of learning. Could transpersonal education have a role in this transformative learning level?
Well, the simple answer is yes, of course. Yeah. So yes, part of the shift is to move from individualism to collectivism. So the idea of learning tends to be the individual, always. It goes back to your point up here, and it has been for decades, of individual learners. And I think when we're talking about societal shifts, then collectivity and community has to be a critical part of the shift we're talking about, because we're living in an increasingly fragmented society where we're all set in competition with each other and so on. I'm reminded now of transition towns. How many people have heard of the transition movement? Anybody? Yeah, so the transition movement, it's fantastic. It started in England. So check it out, transition movement. It's really, they're talking, one of their terms is tapping the collective genius of people, the collective genius. So if you get, the phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, you know. So if you get a group of people together, you get all kinds of things, dynamics and learnings and interesting ideas throwing up that you can't do by yourself. So to regenerate local communities, you need to involve people, obviously, to create that self-reliance and that resilience at a local level. And this is what transition towns and transition movement has found, and they work on local solutions to health, to energy, to growing, or whatever, you know, shelter, whatever it is. And I think, you know, if you look at the course of economic development over 30, 50 years, if you like, or even more, we've had, you know, if you look at the idea of regenerative economics, if you like, which is a new way of thinking and doing, if you look at the opposite of, what's the opposite of regenerative? It's degenerative. The opposite of regenerative is degenerative. And I think in a way, you know, global capitalism, the model as it's emerged, has been degenerative to communities and to ecosystems. And we're having all these issues now. So the regenerative movement, at local level particularly, is trying to put stuff back, because we live in an extractive economy, the linear economy. You know, here's the source, here's the sink, and the whole lot's going through. And the limits to, I'm going off at a tangent here, but you know, part of the limits to growth study is that we need to reduce the throughput in the system. So the Earth is a closed system, fundamentally. And the limits to growth says we need to reduce the throughput of energy and materials through the system. So that's, you know, the idea of sufficiency is really key to sustainability. You know, somebody once wrote a paper for the World Watch Institute called "How Much is Enough?" How much is enough? Well, in the global capitalist system, nothing's enough. You have to have growth all the time. And there's another paper called "Over the Horizon," written by an academic called Crownshaw and Associates in Canada a few years ago. Over the Horizon is talking about unless we anticipate anticipate a post-growth world, we're going to be experiencing huge issues. And they argue, these academics argue, that the way that the trajectories are now, that we're going to be in a post-growth, degrowth world at some point this century, whether we like it or not. It's best that we anticipate it and ease down on this growthist way of doing things, because we need to. And if you look at the limits to the planetary limits, there's 9 planetary limits. We're now, a paper came out just a couple of weeks ago saying last year, October 2023, we'd breached 6 of the planetary limits. We've now just about breached 7 planetary limits. And it's not good, you know, we need to ease down. So part of that is regenerating economies and ecologies at local level, and local growing and local resilience and all that stuff. So it's a whole huge agenda which is being worked through. And I think formal education is happening anyway out there. The transition town movement is part of that movement. It's happening anyway, and I think formal education, it's a learning process, and I think formal education has to be part of that process, part of that remaking society process. And I talk about it in this book in some depth. Sorry, that's a very long answer, which I hope makes some sense.
So let me take the advantage of being the host of the session and ask you the last question. So it's clear from your analysis, one thing I come up is that we need a systemic change, right? But then,
well, it's not. Yes, it's not just me. There's an awful lot of people saying that.
Yeah, I know. But then you said that this involves it's a learning journey. So what I got is so you mentioned that it is a learning journey. It involves everybody and it takes time.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
But time is limited, so we don't have all the time, and it looks like we are running out of time.
Yeah.
So trying to build on your possibilityism, what can we do to speed up the process?
Okay, so, well, I've said this already, but when I was doing the research for the book, I was surprised by the amount of new initiatives and really good things happening around the world, which is great. So I think one thing is to take heart from that, take encouragement from what's happening. The second one is to learn from it, because there's such good practice going on. We don't need to reinvent the wheel each time. Thirdly, is to form alliances. So if I go back to my experience at my university, what we did is create a community of practice, if you like to use that term, community of practice. So we found students and staff right across the university who wanted to be part of this movement. So we made links between people, and so things happened because we made these links. And it was very exciting because people felt enabled to do things they weren't enabled to do when they just kept within their departments and their boxes, you know. So I think it's a matter of, the phrase I use is developing a collective intelligence. Collective, connective intelligence. So that the body within the university which is doing this stuff is like a network which is in touch the whole time. It's a bit like the sort of mycelium, you know, in a fungi, if you like, and it works. So I think the connectivity, whether it's within the university or outside the university, and working with groups for change, is the key. Is the key to this, and learning from experience, as I said earlier. And I just I'm just against all the bad news, I'm encouraged by the amount of positive, inventive, ingenious things which are happening to redevelop local economies and society, communities, and restoring soil health or local growing or whatever it is, you know. And I think two of the ideas which are taking off. One is the idea of co-benefits. So ideas where co-benefits is where you do things where you get positive synergies happening because of the initiative. So for example, if you pedestrianize the street in a town, you reduce air pollution, you get people walking, you start greening up the street, you can get healthier air because of the action of the trees, you can develop the local economy. You get, I think this is part of ecological design, to get co-benefits from doing action. So that's one thing, this idea of co-benefits. Another one is globally, people are worried about tipping points, and there's a report about tipping points I put up there, but some of the teams on looking at global tipping points in terms of Earth systems are now talking about positive tipping points socially, and they're seeing positive tipping points is a way of getting social change. So that's something you could check out, the idea of positive tipping points. So all this stuff is quite new, and it's happening now, and it's a matter of being plugged into that, plugged into what's happening and being part of it.
Okay, so with these optimistic last words, let's stop here, and thanks everybody for coming, and thanks Stephen for the talk. Thank you.